Hi everybody, it's Courtney and welcome. Today I'm going to create a card with the Studio Katia Lovely Blooms stamp set, and I'm going to try some highlight stamping here. I've never tried it before and I'm going to do it a little bit different. This is a pretty big stamp, so I am using my Misty here and I'm stamping on a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock cut down to 4 1/4 by 5 1/2. And I am stamping with Simon Says Stamp Intense Black ink. And I'm actually going to double stamp this just to make sure I get a really bold black image. And once my stamping was done, I did leave my stamp right in my Misty just in case I wanted to restamp after my coloring was done. Once my first image was stamped out, I went ahead and just flipped over my card panel and stamped that in the other corner as well. Next, I took a piece of Post-it note tape and just went from corner to corner and masked out 1/2 of the card. And I'll start with the bottom part here, and I'm going to be using my C markers. And this 1/2 is going to be all shaded with grays and neutral tones. And I've said this before, but normally with your C markers and as well as your W markers, you can usually start with your darkest color and they blend very well. In this case, I am starting with my lightest color and just mapping out my shadow areas, primarily because it's kind of hard to tell, especially when you get close to where you've masked out what you're coloring. So here I'm using the packaging of the stamp to kind of see what the next image is next to what I'm coloring. And I'm only going up to the tape where I've masked out. I kind of keep lifting it up to make sure that I'm not going too far, and then I am coloring the flower petal the correct way, because you always want to go with the direction of the petal. So I started with my lightest color just in case I made a mistake. That way it was easier to cover up. Once I had that laid down, I went to my darkest color, which is my C7, and just went over the very darkest areas of each petal. So my darkest areas will be where the petal kind of lays on top of itself and towards the center of the flower. The center of the flower is kind of caved in a bit. So you want to make sure that that's a darker area. Also, there are some lines within this image, so you want to pay attention to those. Those kind of give you a guide and let you know where those darkest areas should be. Any petal that's laying on another petal, the petal that's underneath will be darker, so you'll have a very small highlight, if any highlight at all. Once my darkest color was laid out, I went ahead and moved on to my C5 and my C3. These will be my two mid-tone colors, and this is where I'll really start with my flicks. Some of the larger petals I do flick a little bit with my dark color, but for the most part, I just kind of lay in just a line, barely touching the paper. Once I move on to my midtones, that's when I'll start flicking those out. And like I said, those petals that are laying behind the center petals will pretty much be the darkest and have a very small highlight. So my C1, once I get to my C1, most of those petals won't even have any C1. The center of the flower, I'm not really worried about. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with that. In the end, I went ahead and just covered up that area with a white gel pen. I really wasn't worried about shading too much. Now for these petals where the Post-it note tape is kind of laying over the center of the petal, those petals will eventually be two tones. One part of it will be gray and one part will be, I ended up coloring them purple. So you just have to make sure that you go right up to that line and preserve that mask. For the little areas that are the areas of the petal that's folded over on itself. Some of the larger areas I did add a little bit of shading with my C3, so it wasn't just completely the C1, which is nearly white. Once I was done with my C markers, there are a couple of leaves here, and I'm going to also be using grays, but I'll switch over to my warm grays, so it'll be a little bit different from the flower itself. I apologize for my lighting here. I usually rely on the sunlight, and it's super dark today, so my lighting is a little off. So I started off with my darkest color, which is my the W7, and then I'll move on to my W5, then my W3, and then my highlight will be the W1. For these little tiny flowers that are behind this larger flower, I didn't want to color them with the C or W markers just because they would blend in a little bit too much. So I'm using my E74 and E70. Now the cap looks like it's brown, but it's more of a grayish brown. So it actually went really well with my cool grays and my warm grays. So I'm just laying out my darkest areas with that darker color, and then I'll just go over the entire thing with the E70. These are really, really tiny flowers, so you don't need to do much shading on these. Now I did the same exact thing for the other side of the panel, the top, I guess you would call it. The coloring was a little bit different just because it's not the same exact part of the stamp that I'm coloring, but the techniques is still the same. Once my grays were all colored in, I went ahead and moved on to my colors. So I'm coloring this large flower with purples, and I'm starting off with my lightest color, doing the same exact thing, laying out my darkest areas. Now it's a little bit easier to see now that I removed that mask, but I want to make sure that I don't go over the grays too much. I want to make sure that where that mask was, it remains a straight line separating the neutral tones and the colors. Next, I'll move on to my darkest color, which is a V09, and this is a super, super dark purple. So you want to make sure that you're using this sparingly unless you really want a dark flower. So I'm just laying out these light lines, and for the larger petals, again, maybe a few little flicks, but not really all that much. I'll save my flicking for my two midtones. And again, on the petals that kind of are split in between the two sections, you just want to make sure that you're not going over those grays. If the gray goes over the purple, it's not a big deal. It's just going to add a little bit more shading for you because you can actually shade with the grays and then color right over them. But you want to make sure that you're not getting the purple over the gray because that would be very difficult to take out. Next, I'll move on to my two mid-tone colors, which is my V06 and my V04. And I'll do the same thing as I did with my grays. I'll just flick those out. Add a little bit of shading to those larger areas where the petals laying over one another. Here my markers seem to get a little bit juicier than normal. So if you see that happening, go ahead and take off the other cap on the larger nib, because this will, I don't know what it does, but something with the pressure within the marker, it will relieve that so that you don't get a blob that comes out, which is difficult sometimes to take away. Once my two midtones were down, I moved on again to my highlight, and very little highlighting on those petals that are behind the flower, the middle of the flower. And I decided to do the middle of this flower. I left that white. There are some areas that kind of bled through a little bit, but I'm going to end up going with my gel pen on this one as well. I decided to keep the center of all of the flowers white on both sides of the panel. Next, for my leaves, I'll move on to my favorite combination for darker leaves. And I'm laying out my lightest color. I'm just coloring in the entire leaf here with my G20. And then I'll move on to my G28, which is my darkest color, concentrating on the darkest areas being closer to the flower, where those leaves are kind of laying underneath the flower. Then I'll go in with my two midtones and then back to my lightest color. And just the very, very tips of those leaves will have that highlight. For these little flowers, I decided to do them, color them yellow. And it's kind of like an orangish yellow. It's a darker yellow. And again, I'm just starting with my darkest color. Then I'll move on to my lightest color, being these areas are so tiny. And then I colored the other side of the panel the same exact way. Next, I took my ruler here and I'm taking a Copic Safe pen. I'm using an EK Success journaling pen for this. And I'm just creating my line to separate the gray and the colored area, but I'm not going over the flowers. I'm just going over the center of the card. Then I knew it needed something. So I took another piece of Post-it note tape and masked out the gray area. And I'm using Pumice Stone Distress ink. And I'm going with a very, very light hand here. I want to make sure that I don't go over my flowers too much. I could have masked them out. I was honestly just being a little bit lazy. So I'm starting with my darkest area being closest to that mask, closest to the Post-it note tape, and just extending that out. Again, very light hand. If I have to go over it several times, that's fine. And then it will kind of fade to almost white towards that corner. Once I was happy with the ink that I had down on the panel, I removed my Post-it note tape. Next, I'll go ahead and add my sentiment with my VersaFine Onyx Black ink. And I'm just going to stamp that right along that line. Then I'll take my gel pen and go over those centers of the flowers. And there's a couple areas where when I took off the cap of one of my markers, it kind of splattered. So I'll just go over that area with my white gel pen as well and just clean that up. Now I wish I would have left the panel like this, but I ended up adding a couple of Nouveau drops here in Pale Periwinkle. It dries nearly clear with just a little bit of a little hint of purple. I wish I would have left this off, but it's okay. It didn't end up too bad. But that's it for today. Thanks so much for stopping by, and I hope you guys have a great day.